In 111 BC, a foreign king walked out of Rome after committing murder in the heart of the city itself. He had assassinated a rival claimant to his throne, a man under the official protection of the Roman Senate, and he was walking away without so much as a slap on the wrist. The king's name was Jugurtha, and he ruled the North African kingdom of Numidia. He had come to Rome to answer charges of corruption, bribery, and violation of treaty obligations. Instead, he had simply bribed more people. Tribunes, senators, magistrates, everyone had their price, and Jugurtha had paid it. As he passed through the gates of Rome, heading back to Africa a free man, Jugurtha reportedly turned and looked back at the city that called itself the master of the world. And he said something that would echo through the centuries: a city for sale and doomed to perish if only it finds a bier. It was one of the most savage insults ever delivered to Rome, and the worst part, it was absolutely true. The Jugurthine War is not a story about a great military campaign. There were no legendary battles, no tactical masterstrokes, no moments of martial genius that changed the course of history. What the Jugurthine War exposed was something far more dangerous than any enemy army. It exposed that Rome was rotten to its core. This is the story of an African king who didn't just fight Rome, he bought it. A man who turned Roman corruption into a weapon and wielded it more effectively than any sword. A ruler who proved that the greatest empire the world had ever seen could be manipulated, stalled, and humiliated by anyone willing to pay the price. And in the end, this story isn't really about Jugurtha at all. It's about what happens when a republic loses its soul and whether it can ever get it back. To understand Jugurtha, you need to understand Numidia, and to understand Numidia, you need to understand one of the most remarkable relationships in ancient history. Numidia occupied what is now Algeria and parts of Tunisia, a vast territory stretching from the Mediterranean coast into the fringes of the Sahara Desert. It was a land of contrasts: fertile coastal plains, rugged mountains, endless expanses of semi-arid steppe. The Numidians themselves were a Berber people, famed throughout the ancient world for one thing above all else: their cavalry. Numidian horsemen were legendary. They rode small, fast horses without saddles or bridles, controlling their mounts with their knees while hurling javelins at the enemy with deadly accuracy. They could pursue a retreating army for miles, harass a marching column until it collapsed from exhaustion, or screen a battlefield so effectively that the enemy never knew what was coming. Every major power in the Mediterranean wanted Numidian cavalry on their side. Carthage had used them for centuries. The Ptolemies of Egypt recruited them. And Rome had learned the value of Numidian horsemen the hard way during the brutal wars against Hannibal. In the Second Punic War, Numidian cavalry had ridden with Hannibal at Cannae, helping to encircle and annihilate the largest Roman army ever assembled. Numidian riders had harassed Roman supply lines throughout Italy. They had been, in many ways, the key to Hannibal's tactical dominance. But then something changed. A young Numidian prince named Massinissa switched sides. Massinissa had started the war fighting for Carthage, but a series of personal grievances combined with a shrewd assessment of which way the wind was blowing led him to defect to Rome. He brought his cavalry with him. And at the Battle of Zama in 200 BC, Numidian horsemen fighting for Rome helped destroy Hannibal's army and end the war. Rome rewarded Massinissa handsomely. They made him king of a unified Numidia, incorporating territories that had previously belonged to rival chiefs. They gave him Roman support against his enemies. They treated him as a valued ally and friend of the Roman people. In return, Massinissa gave Rome everything it asked for: grain, soldiers, cavalry, political support. Whatever Rome needed, Massinissa provided. For over 50 years, until his death in 148 BC at the reported age of 90, Massinissa was Rome's most loyal client king. The relationship worked because both sides understood the bargain. Rome protected Numidia from its enemies. Numidia supported Rome's Mediterranean ambitions. Neither side tried to dominate the other. It was a partnership, not a subjugation, but partnerships require trust. And trust, once broken, is very hard to rebuild. Massinissa had many sons. Ancient sources suggest as many as 44, but when he died, his kingdom passed to his three legitimate heirs, Micipsa, Gulusa, and Mastanable. Within a few years, Gulusa and Mastanable were dead, leaving Micipsa as sole king. Micipsa was a very different man from his father. Where Massinissa had been a warrior, constantly expanding his kingdom through military conquest, Micipsa was a builder and administrator. He developed New Midia's agriculture, encouraged trade, and transformed the capital city of Jugurtha into a center of Greek culture and learning. He invited philosophers, artists, and scholars to his court. He was, in short, a man of peace. Unfortunately, he had a problem. Mastanable, his deceased brother, had left behind an illegitimate son named Jugurtha. Illegitimate children occupied a complicated position in ancient royal families. They had royal blood, which made them potentially dangerous, but they had no clear claim to the throne, which made them useful. Micipsa adopted Jugurtha and raised him alongside his own two sons, Odd Hairball and Heimpsal, but he never quite decided what to do with him. Jugurtha was everything Micipsa was not. He was tall, handsome, athletic, and charismatic. He was a superb horseman, a fearless hunter, and a natural leader of men. The Numidian nobles adored him. The soldiers would have followed him anywhere. Micipsa recognized Jugurtha's talents and found himself in an impossible position. If he promoted Jugurtha, he risked overshadowing his own sons, who were notably less impressive. If he marginalized Jugurtha, he risked creating a bitter enemy with the skills and popularity to cause real trouble. In the end, Micipsa chose what seemed like a clever middle path. He sent Jugurtha to Spain to serve with the Roman army in its wars against the Celti-Iberian tribes. The thinking was probably something like this: maybe Jugurtha would be killed in battle, problem solved. Or maybe he would settle down in Roman service and find a career outside Numidia, also problem solved. Or maybe, at the very least, he would be out of the country and unable to build up a power base at home. It was a reasonable plan. It failed completely. Jugurtha didn't die in Spain. He thrived. The Roman commanders quickly recognized his abilities. He was brave in battle, skilled in tactics, and possessed a natural authority that made soldiers want to follow him. He learned to speak Latin fluently. He made friends among the Roman officers, including some from the most powerful families in Rome. Most importantly, he learned how Rome actually worked. The Roman Republic in the late 2nd century BC was not the austere, virtuous state of legend. That Rome, the Rome of Cincinnatus, who left his plow to save the Republic and then returned to his farm, had been dead for generations. The Rome that Jugurtha encountered was an oligarchy dominated by a handful of wealthy families, where political advancement depended on patronage, bribery, and personal connections. Jugurtha saw Roman senators take bribes. He saw Roman commanders enrich themselves at the expense of their soldiers. He saw how money could buy influence, how favors could be traded, how the entire political system ran on a currency of mutual obligation and corruption, and he took notes. The Roman commander in Spain, Scipio Aemilianus, recognized what was happening. According to the historian Sallust, Scipio pulled Jugurtha aside and gave him a warning. He told the young prince that seeking the friendship of individuals was dangerous, better to cultivate the friendship of the Roman state as a whole. He warned that bribery might work in the short term but would eventually lead to ruin. Jugurtha listened politely and ignored every word. When Jugurtha returned to Numidia around 130 for BC, he was a changed man. He had gone to Spain as a talented but relatively naive young prince. He came back as someone who understood power, how it worked, how it could be acquired, and how it could be bought. Micipsa's clever plan had backfired spectacularly. Instead of neutralizing Jugurtha, the Spanish campaign had made him more dangerous than ever. Micipsa died in 118 BC, leaving his kingdom to be divided among three heirs, his sons Adherbal and Hympsal, and his adopted nephew Jugurtha. It was a recipe for disaster. Hympsal, the younger of Micipsa's natural sons, made no secret of his contempt for Jugurtha. He considered his cousin a bastard, which was technically accurate, and resented sharing power with him. At the first council of the three kings, Hympsal publicly insulted Jugurtha, questioning his right to sit as an equal with the legitimate heirs. Jugurtha responded with a smile, and then he started planning. Within months, Hympsal was dead. The exact circumstances are murky. Ancient sources give conflicting accounts, but the outline is clear enough. Jugurtha sent agents to bribe Hympsal's servants. One night, they opened the doors of the royal residence and let in Jugurtha's soldiers. Hympsal was dragged from his bed and beheaded. It was the first of many murders, and it established the pattern that would define Jugurtha's reign: violence, bribery, and the ruthless elimination of anyone who stood in his way. Adherbal, the surviving brother, fled for his life. He raised an army, fought Jugurtha in open battle, and lost. He fled again, this time all the way to Rome, where he threw himself on the mercy of the Senate. Here was the first real test of Roman policy. Adherbal was a legitimate king, an ally of Rome, driven from his throne by a usurper who had committed murder and violated the terms of Micipsa's will. The case seemed clear-cut, but Jugurtha had already been busy. While Adherbal was making his way to Rome, Jugurtha's agents had arrived first carrying very heavy bags of gold. They distributed bribes to key senators. They cultivated friendships with influential politicians. They reminded everyone of Jugurtha's service in Spain, his connections to powerful Roman families, his value as an ally. By the time Adherbal made his case before the Senate, the fix was in. The Senate's response to the Numidian crisis was a masterpiece of corrupt compromise. They sent a commission to Africa to settle the dispute. The commission was led by Lucius Opimius, a senator whose willingness to take bribes was well established. Shockingly, the commission decided to split Numidia between Jugurtha and Adherbal. Even more shockingly, the split heavily favored Jugurtha. He received the western half of the kingdom, the wealthier, more developed portion, including most of the agricultural land and the lucrative trade routes. Adherbal got the eastern half, poorer and more vulnerable. Adherbal had no choice but to accept. He returned to Africa and tried to make the best of a bad situation. Jugurtha, meanwhile, was just getting started. He had learned the crucial lessons from this first encounter with Roman justice. First, Roman senators could be bought. Second, Rome's commitment to its allies was negotiable. The Senate had chosen the path of least resistance, dividing the kingdom rather than enforcing the terms of Micipsa's will. They had rewarded aggression and punished the victim. Jugurtha concluded correctly that he could push further. Over the next few years, he systematically provoked Adherbal. He sent raiding parties across the border. He encouraged Adherbal's subjects to defect. He created incidents designed to force a confrontation, all while maintaining a pretense of innocence whenever Roman ambassadors came to investigate. Adherbal complained to Rome. Rome sent more ambassadors. Jugurtha bribed them. The ambassadors reported that both sides were at fault, that the situation was complicated, that perhaps everyone should just calm down. By 112 BC, Jugurtha was ready for the final move. He invaded Adherbal's territory with his full army. Adherbal, hopelessly outmatched, retreated to the city of Jugurtha and prepared for a siege. He sent desperate messages to Rome, begging for help. Rome sent another commission. The siege of Jugurtha lasted through the summer and into the fall of 112 BC. Adherbal's situation grew increasingly desperate. The city was running out of food. Disease was spreading. The defenders were exhausted. And still Rome did nothing. The commission arrived, spoke with both sides, and departed without taking any meaningful action. Jugurtha's bribes had done their work. The Romans were, in effect, content to let events take their course. Finally, with Curta on the verge of collapse, the Italian merchants who lived in the city convinced Odd Hairball to surrender. They promised that their connections in Rome would protect him, that Jugurtha wouldn't dare harm a Roman ally with Roman citizens watching. They were wrong. Odd Hairball opened the gates and surrendered to his cousin. Jugurtha immediately had him tortured to death. Some sources say he was flayed alive and then massacred everyone in the city, including the Italian merchants who had guaranteed the surrender. This was a catastrophic miscalculation. Jugurtha had bribed plenty of Roman senators, but he had now killed Roman citizens, Italian businessmen with families and connections back home. These weren't aristocrats who could be bought off or intimidated. They were ordinary people with relatives who demanded justice. The Roman public was outraged. For years, they had watched the Senate handle the Numidian situation with obvious corruption and incompetence. Now Roman blood had been spilled, and the blood demanded an answer. A tribune named Gaius Memmius led the charge. He delivered a blistering speech to the popular assembly, attacking the Senate's corruption and demanding war against Jugurtha. He named names. He accused specific senators of taking bribes. He called for a complete investigation of everyone who had been involved in the Numidian commissions. The Senate, facing a public relations disaster, had no choice but to act. They declared war on Jugurtha and sent an army to Africa under the command of the consul Lucius Calpurnius Bestia. The Jugurthine War had officially begun. Bestia landed in Africa with a substantial army and advanced into Numidian territory. Jugurtha, facing Roman legions for the first time, adopted a sensible strategy. He retreated, avoided battle, and opened negotiations, and he brought his checkbook. Within weeks, Bestia had agreed to a peace treaty on remarkably generous terms. Jugurtha would surrender a token number of elephants and horses, pay a modest indemnity, and acknowledge Roman authority. In exchange, he would keep his throne and his kingdom. It was an absurd outcome. Jugurtha had murdered Roman citizens, defied Roman authority, and violated multiple treaty obligations. Now he was getting away with a slap on the wrist because everyone understood he had paid for the privilege. The outcry in Rome was immediate and furious. Gaius Memmius demanded that Jugurtha be summoned to Rome to testify about who exactly he had bribed. The proposal passed, and Jugurtha was offered safe conduct to appear before the assembly. He came. This was the moment of supreme arrogance, the moment that would define Jugurtha's legend. He walked into Rome itself, surrounded by enemies who wanted him dead, confident that his money would protect him. And it did. When Memmius tried to question Jugurtha before the assembly, another tribune, a man named Gaius Bibius, who had been bribed by Jugurtha's agents, used his veto to prevent the king from speaking. The questioning never happened. Jugurtha's testimony, which might have exposed the full extent of senatorial corruption, was silenced before it could begin. But Jugurtha wasn't finished. While he was in Rome, enjoying the protection of safe conduct, he arranged one more murder. A Numidian prince named Messiva, a grandson of Massinissa and potential rival claimant to Jugurtha's throne, was living in Rome at the time. Roman politicians who opposed Jugurtha had been cultivating Messiva as an alternative, a legitimate king they could install if they ever managed to defeat the usurper. Jugurtha sent an assassin. Messiva was stabbed to death in the streets of Rome. The killer was caught. Under torture, he confessed that he had been acting on Jugurtha's orders. But Jugurtha himself was protected by his safe conduct. The Romans couldn't touch him without violating their own guarantees. So they expelled him. The Senate ordered Jugurtha to leave Rome immediately. And as he walked out the gates, passing from the protection of the city into the dangerous world beyond, he delivered his famous judgment: a city for sale and doomed to perish if only it finds a bier. Then he went home to Africa to fight a war he was increasingly confident he could win. The Roman army that marched into Numidia in 110 BC was supposed to restore Roman honor. It was supposed to punish Jugurtha for his crimes, avenge the murdered Italian merchants, and demonstrate that Rome could not be bought. Instead, it demonstrated exactly the opposite. The commander was Spurius Postumius Albinus, one of the consuls for that year. Albinus was a politician first and a general second, a man more concerned with his career in Rome than with actually winning the war. He spent most of his time in Africa accomplishing nothing, conducting half-hearted operations that never brought Jugurtha to battle, waiting for something to happen. Jugurtha was happy to wait. He understood that time was on his side. Every month the war dragged on, Roman patience wore thinner. Every inconclusive campaign made the Senate more willing to negotiate. And every Roman commander who arrived in Africa was a potential customer. When Albinus had to return to Rome to conduct elections because Roman politics never stopped, even during a war, he left his brother Aulus in command with orders to finish the campaign quickly. Aulus was eager to prove himself. Too eager, he launched a reckless offensive into the Numidian interior, chasing rumors of Jugurtha's treasury hidden in the remote town of Suthul. It was exactly the kind of operation Jugurtha had been hoping for. He let Aulus advance deep into unfamiliar territories, stretching his supply lines, exhausting his troops. Then he struck. The details of what happened next are disputed, but the outcome is clear. Jugurtha's forces surrounded the Roman camp at night. Some sources say he bribed Roman officers to create confusion. Others say the attack was simply well executed. Either way, the Roman army panicked. Aulus found himself trapped, his troops demoralized, his position hopeless. He had no choice but to negotiate. The terms Jugurtha demanded were humiliating beyond anything Rome had experienced in generations. The Roman army would surrender. Every soldier would pass under the yoka ritual of absolute submission, walking beneath a frame of spears to symbolize their defeat. And Rome would evacuate Numidia entirely, abandoning all claims to authority over the kingdom. Aulus accepted. When news reached Rome, the reaction was explosive. The Senate repudiated the treaty immediately, declaring it invalid because Aulus had no authority to make such agreements. But the damage was done. Roman legions had been humiliated. Roman soldiers had passed under the yoke, and Jugurtha was still sitting on his throne, laughing at the greatest power in the world. The war had become a scandal, and scandals in Rome meant political opportunity. A tribune named Gaius Mamilius Limitanus proposed a special commission to investigate everyone involved in the Numidian disaster. Not just the military commanders, but the senators who had taken bribes, the ambassadors who had been bought, the politicians who had enabled Jugurtha's rise. The Mamilian Commission, as it became known, was a political earthquake. For years, the Roman aristocracy had operated on an unspoken understanding. Corruption was tolerated as long as it didn't become too obvious. Everyone knew that senators took gifts from foreign kings. Everyone knew that provincial commands were opportunities for personal enrichment. These were the perks of power, and the ruling class protected each other from consequences. The Mamilian Commission shattered that understanding. One by one, prominent senators were hauled before the commission and forced to answer for their actions. Lucius Opimius, who had led the first commission to divide Numidia, was convicted and exiled. Gaius Sulpicius Galba, another commissioner, suffered the same fate. Lucius Calpurnius Bestia, who had negotiated the shameful peace treaty, was convicted. Even Spurius Postumius Albinus faced charges, though he managed to escape conviction. The trials exposed what everyone had long suspected: the Roman political system was riddled with corruption. Jugurtha hadn't corrupted Rome, he had simply exploited a corruption that already existed. He had found a system for sale and made a purchase. But the trials also revealed something else. There was a deep anger among ordinary Romans at the aristocratic establishment. The people who had died in Numidia, the merchants who had been massacred at Curta, the soldiers who had been humiliated at Suthul, they weren't senators or nobles. They were common people, sacrificed to protect the profits of their betters. This anger would reshape Roman politics for a generation. It would fuel the rise of populist politicians who promised to challenge the aristocratic order. It would eventually tear the Republic apart. But first, Rome needed to actually win the war. The Senate appointed Quintus Caecilius Metellus to take command in Africa. Metellus was everything his predecessors had not been: honest, competent, and determined to fight rather than negotiate. He arrived in 109 BC and immediately set about restoring discipline to the demoralized Roman forces. He purged corrupt officers. He enforced strict training regimens. He punished soldiers who had grown soft during the years of desultory campaigning. Within months, he had transformed a rebel into an army. Then he went after Jugurtha. Metellus understood that conventional warfare in Numidia was nearly impossible. The country was too vast, the terrain too difficult, the Numidian cavalry too mobile. Jugurtha could avoid battle indefinitely, retreating into the desert whenever the Romans advanced, returning to raid their supply lines whenever they stopped. So Metellus adopted a different strategy. Instead of chasing Jugurtha across the wilderness, he focused on taking the cities and towns that formed the economic backbone of the kingdom. He captured Vaga, Zama, and other important centers. He installed Roman garrisons and pro-Roman local officials. He systematically stripped away Jugurtha's base of support. Jugurtha fought back with the only weapons he had: guerrilla tactics and treachery. He ambushed Roman patrols. He assassinated Roman allied officials. He attempted to bribe Metellus and, for once, found a Roman commander who couldn't be bought. At the Battle of the Muffle River in 109 BC, the two armies finally clashed in something like a conventional engagement. Jugurtha sprang an ambush on the Roman column as it crossed difficult terrain, and for several hours the outcome hung in the balance. But Metellus kept his nerve, rallied his troops, and eventually drove the Numidians from the field. It wasn't a decisive victory. Jugurtha escaped with most of his army intact, but it demonstrated that the Romans were finally fighting seriously. The war settled into a grinding stalemate. Metellus took cities, but Jugurtha refused to be cornered. Metellus won battles, but Jugurtha always slipped away. Season after season, the campaign continued without resolution. Meanwhile, in Rome, a new force was rising, a man who would change everything. Gaius Marius was not supposed to become one of the most important figures in Roman history. He was born around 157 BC in the town of Arpinum, about 60 miles southeast of Rome. His family was respectable, but obscure, wealthy enough to qualify for equestrian status, but with no senatorial ancestors, no famous names in their lineage. In the rigid class system of the Roman Republic, this meant that Marius was essentially a nobody. The Roman aristocracy was an exclusive club. The same handful of families had dominated politics for generations, passing consulships and commands among themselves like family heirlooms. An outsider like Marius might serve in the legions, might even reach relatively high military rank, but the summit of power, the consulship, the great commands, the immortal glory was reserved for men with the right bloodlines. Marius didn't care about their rules. He was tough, ambitious, and utterly relentless. He had served with distinction in Spain under Scipio Aemilianus, where he first encountered Jugurtha and earned a reputation for courage and competence. He had climbed the political ladder through sheer force of will, winning election to lower offices despite the opposition of the aristocratic establishment. By 109 BC, he was serving in Africa as one of Metellus's senior officers, and he was growing impatient. Marius believed he could win the war faster than Metellus. He believed the campaign was being prolonged unnecessarily, that Metellus was more interested in accumulating glory than in achieving victory. Whether this was fair criticism or simply ambition talking is hard to say, but Marius made no secret of his views. He began building support among the soldiers and the Italian merchants in Africa. He cultivated relationships with influential equestrians, the wealthy businessmen who had economic interests in Numidia and wanted the war concluded quickly. He sent messages back to Rome, hinting that he could do better if given the chance. When Marius asked Metellus for permission to return to Rome and stand for the consulship, Metellus was dismissive. According to ancient sources, he told Marius that he should be content with his current position, that the consulship could wait until Metellus' own son was old enough to run. His son was about 20 years old. It would be many years before he was eligible for the consulship. It was a calculated insult, a reminder that men like Marius didn't become consuls. The office belonged to families like the Metelli. Marius returned to Rome anyway, and he ran anyway. The consular election of 108 BC was one of the most consequential in Roman history. Marius campaigned as an outsider, a man of the people, a soldier who had earned his honors through merit rather than birth. He attacked the aristocratic establishment with savage rhetoric, mocking their incompetence, their corruption, their inherited privileges. He promised to end the war in Numidia quickly and decisively. The common people loved him. The aristocrats were horrified. Marius won in a landslide, but winning the consulship was only half the battle. Command of the Numidian War was still held by Metellus, and the Senate, dominated by aristocratic families who despised Marius, had no intention of giving the command to an upstart. Marius went over their heads. He appealed directly to the popular assembly, asking the people to transfer the command from Metellus to himself. It was a constitutional crisis, a direct challenge to senatorial authority. The aristocrats screamed that it was illegal, unprecedented, dangerous. The assembly voted for Marius anyway. For the first time in Roman history, a military command had been assigned by popular vote against the wishes of the Senate. It was a revolutionary act, a sign that the old constitutional order was breaking down. The precedent Marius set would be repeated by others, Pompey, Caesar, and eventually the emperors who would replace the Republic entirely. But that was in the future. For now, Marius had a war to win. Marius's first challenge was raising an army. The traditional Roman military system was based on property qualifications. Only citizens who owned a certain amount of land were eligible for service in the legions. The theory was that men who had a stake in society would fight harder to defend it, and that the expense of equipping oneself for war would be borne by those who could afford it. The system had worked well enough for centuries, but by Marius's time it was creaking under the strain. Rome's wars had become longer, more distant, and more demanding. Farmers who served in the legions for years at a time often returned to find their land seized for debt, their families impoverished. The pool of eligible recruits was shrinking even as Rome's military commitments expanded. Marius solved the problem with a simple but revolutionary reform. He opened the legions to anyone who wanted to serve, regardless of property. The landless poor, the urban masses, anyone willing to fight could join. It was a masterstroke of practical politics. Thousands of volunteers flooded to Marius's standard men who had nothing to lose and everything to gain. They would be fiercely loyal to the general who had given them a chance at glory, land, and wealth. But it was also a profound change in the nature of the Roman military. These new soldiers owed their allegiance to Marius personally, not to the Roman state. They would follow him anywhere, do anything he commanded. They were his army, not Rome's. This, too, was a precedent that would echo through history. The private armies of the late Republic, the legions that followed Sulla, Pompey, Caesar, and Antony, all descended from Marius's innovation. He had solved an immediate military problem and created a long-term political catastrophe. But again, that was for the future. Marius took his new army and sailed for Africa. Marius arrived in Numidia in 107 BC and immediately launched an aggressive offensive. His strategy was straightforward: overwhelming force, relentless pressure, and no negotiations. He struck deep into Numidian territory, capturing towns and fortresses that previous commanders had avoided as too difficult or too dangerous. He pursued Jugurtha into the desert, refusing to be deterred by the harsh conditions. Jugurtha responded with his usual tactics: guerrilla raids, strategic retreats, attempts at bribery, but found that none of them worked against Marius. The new Roman commander was incorruptible and implacable. He couldn't be bought, and he couldn't be outmaneuvered. The war ground on through 107 and 106 BC, Marius took city after city, gradually constricting Jugurtha's kingdom. The new Median king lost allies, lost territory, lost everything except his freedom and his life. Finally, Jugurtha made a desperate move. He fled westward to the kingdom of Mauritania, ruled by his father-in-law, King Bocchus. If he could bring Mauritania into the war on his side, he might yet turn the tide. But Bocchus was no fool. He could see which way the war was going. And he had been receiving messages from Marius, offering extremely generous terms for anyone who might be willing to betray Jugurtha. The trap was closing. The man who sprang it was not Marius himself, but his young quaestor, his financial officer, and second in command. His name was Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Sulla was everything Marius was not: aristocratic, refined, educated in Greek literature and philosophy. He came from an ancient patrician family that had fallen on hard times, and he had spent his youth in poverty and dissolution before finding his calling in military service. He was also brilliantly capable, absolutely ruthless, and destined to become one of the most controversial figures in Roman history. Marius sent Sulla to negotiate with Bocchus. It was a dangerous mission. Sulla would be deep in enemy territory, dependent on the good faith of a king who had every reason to betray him. If Bocchus decided that Jugurtha was the better ally, Sulla would be dead. Sulla went anyway. He met with Bocchus, charmed him, convinced him that Rome was the winning side. He promised Bocchus territorial gains, Roman friendship, and protection from any reprisals. He painted a picture of a glorious future as Rome's ally and client. And Bocchus, after agonizing deliberation, made his choice. In 105 BC, Bocchus invited Jugurtha to a meeting, supposedly to discuss strategy. When Jugurtha arrived, he was seized by Bocchus's guards and handed over to Sulla. The Jugurthine War was over. Jugurtha was brought to Rome in chains. The man who had once walked out of the city as a free king, mocking Roman corruption and predicting Roman doom, now entered as a captive. He was paraded through the streets in Marius's triumph, that ancient Roman ceremony celebrating military victory, where the conquering general rode through the city in a golden chariot while the spoils of war and the defeated enemies were displayed to the cheering crowds. It was January 1st, 100 for BC. Marius had timed his triumph to coincide with his entry into his second consulship, an unprecedented honor that he would repeat 5 more times, becoming consul 7 times in total, more than any Roman before him. The crowds that lined the streets were enormous. They had waited years for this moment, years of humiliation and frustration as Jugurtha had bribed and murdered and escaped. Now, finally, justice would be done. Jugurtha walked in the procession, stripped of his royal robes, wearing the simple tunic of a prisoner. Behind him came the treasures of Numidia: gold, silver, ivory, exotic animals, the visible proof of Rome's victory. Ahead of him rode Marius, the savior of the Republic, the man who had succeeded where so many others had failed. When the procession reached the Forum, Jugurtha was taken to the Tullianum, the ancient prison beneath the Capitol Hill, where Rome's most dangerous enemies met their end. It was a small, dark, underground chamber, originally a cistern, now used as a holding cell and execution chamber for those condemned by the state. The guards stripped Jugurtha of his remaining clothing and his golden earrings torn from his ears with such violence that they ripped the lobes. Then they threw him into the pit. Ancient sources describe what happened next in chilling detail. According to the historian Plutarch, Jugurtha was lowered into the Tullianum, and as he descended into the darkness, he laughed and said, "By Hercules, how cold is this bath of yours?" It was his last recorded words, defiant to the end, mocking his captors even as they prepared to kill him. The Romans left him there. No food, no water, no light. Just the cold stone and the darkness and the slow approach of death. Jugurtha lasted 6 days. When they finally pulled his body from the pit, the man who had terrorized Rome for a decade, who had bought senators and murdered rivals and humiliated legions, was dead. He had been a king, a warrior, a master manipulator. Now he was just another corpse in Rome's long history of defeated enemies. The Jugurthine War was truly over, but its consequences were just beginning. The question of who deserved credit for capturing Jugurtha would poison Roman politics for decades. Marius was the commanding general. He had won the war, reorganized the army, and led the campaigns that had broken Numidian resistance. By every traditional measure, the victory belonged to him. But Sulla had actually captured Jugurtha. He had undertaken the dangerous diplomatic mission. He had convinced Bocchus to betray his son-in-law. He had physically received the prisoner. Without Sulla's daring and skill, the war might have dragged on for years more. Sulla was acutely aware of this, and he made sure everyone else was too. He commissioned a signet ring depicting the moment of Jugurtha's surrender, Bocchus handing the captive to Sulla, and wore it constantly. He told the story at every opportunity. He made it clear that he, not Marius, was the true hero of the Jugurthine War. Marius was furious. He saw Sulla's claims as a direct challenge to his glory, an attempt by an aristocratic upstart to steal credit for a victory that belonged to a man of the people. The two men had worked together effectively during the war, but their relationship curdled into bitter rivalry. This rivalry would escalate over the following decades, fueled by class resentment, political ambition, and personal hatred. It would eventually explode into open civil war, with Marius and Sulla leading armies against each other in the streets of Rome itself. Thousands would die, the constitution would be shattered. The Republic would never recover, but that's getting ahead of ourselves. For now, in 100 for BC, the immediate crisis was resolved. Jugurtha was dead. Numidia was pacified. Rome had won. The question was, what had Rome become in the process of winning? The Jugurthine War lasted from 112 to 105 BC, 7 years of fighting for what should have been a relatively straightforward conflict. Numidia was not a great power. It had no navy, no vast armies, no sophisticated military technology. By any objective measure, Rome should have crushed Jugurtha within a year or two. Instead, the war dragged on for the better part of a decade because Rome was too corrupt to fight it effectively. The Mammalian Commission had exposed the rot, but it hadn't cured it. The senators who were convicted and exiled were simply replaced by other senators equally susceptible to bribery. The system that had allowed Jugurtha to buy his way out of trouble remained intact. The underlying incentive structure, where provincial commands were opportunities for personal enrichment, where foreign policy was for sale, where justice depended on wealth, was unchanged. Jugurtha's famous judgment, "A city for sale," was not just an insult. It was an accurate description of how the Roman Republic actually functioned. This mattered because corruption wasn't just a moral failing. It was a strategic vulnerability. Enemies who understood Roman corruption could exploit it. Allies who saw Roman corruption could lose faith. The perception that Rome could be bought undermined the fear and respect that held the empire together. For generations, Rome had conquered the Mediterranean through a combination of military power and political reliability. Rome's word was good. Rome protected its allies. Rome punished its enemies. This reputation was as valuable as any legion because it convinced potential opponents that resistance was futile and convinced potential allies that partnership was safe. Jugurtha had demonstrated that the reputation was hollow. He had bribed Roman commanders, manipulated Roman politics, murdered Roman allies, and walked away unpunished multiple times. Other kings and peoples were watching. They were drawing conclusions. The damage to Roman prestige was immense and lasting. In the years following the Jugurthine War, Rome would face a series of crises that can be traced, in part, to the perception of weakness that Jugurtha's defiance had created. Even more significant than the external damage was the internal transformation. The Jugurthine War accelerated changes in Roman politics and society that would eventually destroy the Republic. Consider what happened during those 7 years. The traditional aristocratic monopoly on power was broken. Marius, a new man with no noble ancestors, had risen to the consulship through popular support rather than senatorial approval. He had demonstrated that an outsider could reach the highest office by appealing directly to the people, bypassing the aristocratic gatekeepers. This precedent would be repeated by others, including, eventually, a certain Julius Caesar. The relationship between generals and soldiers was transformed. Marius's military reforms created legions that were personally loyal to their commander rather than to the state. These soldiers expected their general to provide for them land, money, opportunities, and they would follow him against anyone who stood in his way, including the Roman government itself. The private army had been born. The popular assembly had asserted its power over military commands, overruling the Senate. This set a precedent for politicians to use popular support as a weapon against the aristocratic establishment. The balance of power that had sustained the Republic for centuries was shifting. The tribunate had become a platform for attacking senatorial corruption. Tribunes like Gaius Memmius and Gaius Mamilius had built their careers on exposing and prosecuting aristocratic wrongdoing. This politicization of corruption investigations would become a regular feature of late Republican politics, with each faction using accusations of misconduct as weapons against the other. All of these developments had roots that predated the Jugurthine War, but the war brought them into sharp focus, accelerated their development, and demonstrated their potential power. The conflict in Numidia was a catalyst, transforming latent tensions into active forces. There's something almost tragic about Jugurtha himself. He was, by any measure, an extraordinarily capable individual. He was brave, intelligent, charismatic, and adaptable. He understood his enemies better than they understood themselves. He played a weak hand with remarkable skill, prolonging a conflict he should have lost quickly against an opponent vastly more powerful than himself. In different circumstances, born into a different kingdom, at a different time he might have been remembered as a great ruler. He had the talents for it. What he lacked was the strategic position. Numidia was too weak, Rome was too strong, and no amount of cleverness could ultimately overcome that fundamental imbalance. His tragedy was that he could see exactly how corrupt his enemies were, could exploit that corruption brilliantly, but could never quite close the deal. Every time he seemed to have escaped, something pulled him back. The murder at Curta that turned Roman public opinion against him. The Mamilian Commission that swept away his purchased allies. The incorruptible commanders, first Metellus, then Marius, who couldn't be bought. He ran out of tricks at the worst possible moment. But perhaps the deeper tragedy is what his story reveals about the limits of individual agency. Jugurtha was a master manipulator operating within a system. He could exploit the system's weaknesses, but he couldn't change its fundamental nature. Rome was corrupt, but Rome was also powerful beyond anything Numidia could match. In the end, the power mattered more than the corruption. The city was for sale, as Jugurtha said, but it was also strong enough to survive being sold at least for a while longer. What happened to the other players in this drama? Numidia was divided after the war. The western portion went to Bocchus as a reward for his betrayal of Jugurtha, a reminder that treachery was profitable when practiced on Rome's behalf. The eastern portion went to a Numidian prince named Gauda, a half-brother of Jugurtha who had remained loyal to Rome throughout the conflict. Bocchus proved to be a reliable client king, maintaining Mauritania's alliance with Rome for the rest of his reign. He had made the smart play, and it paid off. His descendants would rule Mauritania for another century until the kingdom was finally absorbed into the Roman Empire under the Emperor Claudius. Gauda and his successors ruled eastern Numidia as Roman clients, their kingdom gradually shrinking as Roman influence expanded. The independent Numidia that Massinissa had built was gone forever. In its place was a satellite state dependent on Roman protection, subject to Roman demands. Metellus returned to Rome bitter and resentful. He had done the hard work of rebuilding the army and turning the tide of the war, only to see Marius steal the credit and the command. He received a triumph and the honorific surname Numidicus, conqueror of Numidia, but he never forgave Marius for the humiliation. The rivalry between the Metelli and Marius would continue for years, contributing to the factional conflicts that tore the Republic apart. Marius went on to become the most powerful man in Rome. He served 6 more consulships, commanded armies against the terrifying Cimbri and Teutonese Germanic tribes that threatened to overwhelm Italy, and saved the Republic from what seemed like certain destruction. He was hailed as the 3rd founder of Rome, after Romulus and Camillus, but his later career was marked by violence, paranoia, and excess. He allied with radical politicians, feuded with the Senate, and eventually became locked in a death struggle with Sulla. In 88 BC, when Sulla marched his legions into Rome, the first Roman general to conquer his own city, Marius fled into exile. He returned in 87 BC with an army of his own, massacred his enemies, and died shortly afterward, broken in body and mind. Sulla won the final round. He made himself dictator, executed thousands of opponents through the infamous proscriptions, and attempted to restore the traditional aristocratic order through a series of constitutional reforms. Then, in an act that shocked everyone, he resigned his dictatorship and retired to private life, dying in 78 BC as reforms didn't last. The forces he and Marius had unleashed, the private armies, the popular politics, the willingness to use violence for political ends, continued to build until they destroyed the Republic entirely. The final act came in the generation after Marius and Sulla. Julius Caesar, who was Marius's nephew by marriage, inherited the populist tradition and the military model that Marius had pioneered. He built an army personally loyal to himself, conquered Gaul, and eventually marched on Rome just as Sulla had done. The civil wars that followed killed hundreds of thousands and ended with Caesar's assassination and the rise of his adopted son, Augustus. Augustus became the first emperor, ending the republic that had lasted for nearly 500 years. The Senate still met, the magistrates still served, the forms of republican government continued, but real power now belonged to one man. Was this outcome inevitable? Historians have argued about this for centuries. Perhaps the Republic was doomed regardless of what happened in Numidia. Perhaps the structural problems, the stress of governing a vast empire with institutions designed for a city-state, would have destroyed it anyway. But the Jugurthine War certainly accelerated the process. It exposed the corruption at the heart of the system. It elevated men like Marius who would bend the rules in pursuit of power. It created the precedents, popular commands, private armies, constitutional crisis that would be repeated with increasing frequency until the Republic finally collapsed. Jugurtha was right. The city was for sale. And while it didn't perish immediately, the rot he had identified would eventually prove fatal. There's one more irony worth mentioning. The historian who preserved most of what we know about the Jugurthine War was a man named Gaius Sallustius Crispus Sallust. He wrote his account of the war, called the Bellum Jugurthinum, around 40 BC, when the Republic was in its final death throes. Sallust was himself a politician who had been expelled from the Senate for immorality. He had served under Julius Caesar, who restored his career. He had governed the province of Africa Novacarve from the territories that had once been Numidian and allegedly enriched himself through spectacular corruption. In other words, the man who wrote the most influential account of how Roman corruption enabled Jugurtha was himself famously corrupt. Sallust's history is a masterpiece of moralizing. He presents the Jugurthine War as a story of noble Romans corrupted by greed, of a republic losing its virtue, of the old values being betrayed by a degenerate aristocracy. He puts stirring speeches in the mouths of reformers and damning indictments of the establishment. And yet Sallust himself was part of the problem he was describing. He benefited from the same systems he criticized. He enriched himself through the same methods he condemned. This doesn't make his analysis wrong. If anything, it makes it more credible. Sallust understood corruption because he practiced it. He recognized the disease because he was infected by it. Perhaps that's the final lesson of the Jugurthine War. Corruption is not something done by bad people to good societies. It's a systemic problem, a set of incentives that shape behavior regardless of individual virtue. Sallust could see clearly what was wrong with Rome while still participating in the wrongdoing because the system made it rational to do so. Jugurtha understood this instinctively. He didn't corrupt Rome, he simply paid the going rate for what Rome was already selling. The senators who took his bribes weren't villains. They were rational actors responding to the incentives they faced. The system rewarded corruption and punished integrity, so corruption flourished. Changing that dynamic would have required fundamental reforms that threatened the interests of the powerful, reforms that no one with power had any incentive to enact. So the corruption continued, growing worse over time until it consumed the republic entirely. What can we learn from this story 2,000 years later? Perhaps the most obvious lesson is that institutions matter more than individuals. Rome had brave soldiers, brilliant generals, dedicated reformers, and none of them could fix the underlying problems because the problems were structural. You can't solve corruption by punishing corrupt individuals if the system continues to reward corruption. You can't restore virtue by giving speeches about virtue if the incentives push toward vice. Jugurtha saw this clearly, and he exploited it ruthlessly. He didn't try to defeat Rome for military genius. He knew he couldn't. He attacked Rome's weak point, its venality, and he came remarkably close to succeeding. Another lesson is that corruption has costs beyond the moral. The Jugurthine War should have been short and decisive. Instead, it dragged on for 7 years because Roman commanders were more interested in enriching themselves than in winning. This prolonged suffering wasted resources and damaged Roman credibility. Corruption isn't just wrong, it's inefficient. The third lesson is about the dangers of allowing political systems to become transactional. When everything is for sale, offices, commands, judgments, treaties, then those with the most money will eventually control everything. This undermines legitimacy, breeds resentment, and creates openings for demagogues who promise to smash the corrupt system. Marius rose to power precisely because people were fed up with aristocratic corruption. He presented himself as a man of the people, an outsider who would clean up the mess, and he did defeat Jugurtha. But he also set precedents that would be exploited by men far more dangerous than himself. The cure was almost as destructive as the disease.